gang. This week we have a couple of unusual electrics that sort of fall into a category that might be labeled, what if we did that? Some guitars that came about in the 70s when the spirit of engineering adventure reared its head, and some smaller makers started producing instruments that were a little bit off the beaten track. Aluminum necks. Yes, these guitars are so metal, man. Travis Bean, which is a great name for an inventor of any kind, was a machinist from California. He was born in 1947 and passed away in 2011. I don't have a huge amount of information about the man himself. He was a pretty low-profile guy, especially in later years. There are some resources on the web. I'm leaning heavily on the Travis Bean Guitars website, which isn't official. It's a fan site that hasn't been updated in a very long time. The administrator there was apparently working on a documentary for a few years in sort of the early 2000s, but that does not seem to have materialized. What I do know is Travis formed his company in Sun Valley in 1974, partnering with Gary Kramer and Mark McElwee. They started building guitars and basses with necks that were machined from solid aluminum billets. They made around 3,600 in total before the operation closed in 1979. Gary Kramer decided to split with Travis early on, because apparently Bean was sort of a hands-on guy, and he didn't want to deal with all of the administrative work, and it fell on Gary. That's the age-old tale of small shop lutherie. A lot of guys want to make sawdust. Nobody wants to handle the dealer relations or keeping up with the payroll. So Kramer, who was also a hands-on guy, I guess he figured that if he had to do all that paperwork and stuff that he didn't want to do, he might as well make his own company so he would get paid more for doing it. So he split, and by 1976 he'd found some investors and was making his own improved version that included wood inserts in the neck, ostensibly to make them less heavy and less cold in your hands. Well, they're still pretty heavy and still quite cold. I'm not sure how many of these were made, but they kept at it for a couple of years longer than Bean. By the early 80s, Kramer decided to drop the aluminum neck design altogether and just go with old-fashioned wood. He got into producing super strats as part of a wave of small California makers that all tried to test Fender's ability to defend its headstock shape, like Charvel being the other big name. They all got cease and desist letters, so he just sanded off the bumpy parts of the headstock, made it pointy like a shark's fin, and kept on going. At some point he got hooked up with Eddie Van Halen. He got into the early development of locking trem systems, and he started having stuff built overseas. A lot of 1980s hair bands got into the Kramer guitars. Richie Sambora had a signature model. By around 1990, shred metal was out, and the company had leveraged itself into too many places. It fell apart. Travis Bean has a bit of a following, and it seems like he might have had that right from the get-go. Jerry Garcia, Ace Frehley, a number of the Rolling Stones, Joe Perry, Stanley Gordon. A lot of big stars acquired them, in a company that was only around for 5 years. They're not usually the primary instrument these artists are associated with, but you can imagine Bean must have had someone who could talk to the roadies and get in good with them so that you could get these guitars in the stars' hands. These are really just in for a setup and a quick look-see. There's a little ding on the back of the Kramer neck, but mostly I'll be cleaning up the frets and making sure they're all ready to go. And yeah, they're heavy. This one I put on the scale, and it's around 11.5 pounds. So, like, in line with the heaviest Les Pauls. But despite that, they seem to balance okay. This one has a lot of metal past the area of the neck joint, and it's made of koa, which is a pretty dense wood. There's a lot of mass there. This is the TB1000S model, which is the standard, a flat-top version. They made just over 1,400 of these. There's also a carved-top version, the Artist, which they made about half as many, like in the 700s, slightly rarer. There's no truss rod in this neck, for obvious reasons. Relief is around 4 thousandths, which is pretty tight. And the action is just over 4/64ths. Might be able to take that down a little bit. I'm missing the high E string here, but that is, again, around 4/64ths, 1/16 of an inch, 1.5 millimeters, 62 thousandths. This thing has some decent play wear on it. There's a bunch of little pinpricky marks there that looks like someone was wearing a studded cuff in the 80s. And the included knots have caused cracking in the lacquer. Beautiful piece of koa. On the back here you can see that it's sort of like a half neck through design. There are string holes drilled right through this billet of aluminum, and there are anchoring points for the pickups as well. Let's have a look under here. Good piece of shielding. And yeah, pretty familiar stuff. Just like you'd find in a Gibson. Honkin' big caps. Those are rated for 600 volts. Yep, all very familiar. I'm just going to use a little bit of this Never Dull from a can my father purchased in the 1980s. It's cotton with a very fine polishing compound impregnated in it, just to clean up some of the chrome here a little bit. There's a lot of sticky dirt on the Brazilian board. Polishing, polishing, polishing. Just a little touch of oil to bring back the color. Oh, that's fun. One of the height adjustment grub screw sockets is stripped. These are the vintage ones that are just tiny. They take the 1/16 of an inch hex key. If you're dealing with an old guitar that hasn't been set up in decades, put it in there and you meet any resistance at all, you've got to stop. Take the whole thing apart and soak it in some kind of penetrating product. Yes, penetration is paramount. Because the least little bit of over torquing on these and it's going to strip. Let us compare and contrast. The Kramer is a different guitar. It's slightly lighter, having a maple body, and the neck feels quite different. It's a little slimmer, and, well, the Bean's neck is very chunky. So this is smaller only in comparison. It's still, you know, a big neck, but it's not anywhere near the Bean's. This has got a 0 fret, and the weird thing is, despite having a longer scale length, this one is 25 inches. It feels like less of a stretch than the Bean, which is only 24.5. That's a pretty short scale. The Bean doesn't play like a short scale guitar. The pickups are smaller, more in line with the size of a mini bucker, and the controls are simpler. It's basically a Telecaster. The neck is still kind of cold in the hand, maybe a bit warmer than the Bean. The Bean is just a block of ice when you pick it up. Similar neck relief, about 5 thousandths. Beautifully minimalist headstock shape, which has been lacquered over, so it has a different character. The lacquer has yellowed a bit over time, so it doesn't have that sort of raw aluminum appeal of the Bean, but yeah, I think it's pretty cool. Where the Bean has a rosewood board, this one has what I think is probably micarta. I'm seeing lines here that look like the plies in a resin and fabric sandwich. It's like ebony, but it's not ebony. This one has a bit more fret wear than the Bean. It requires some recrowning in the lower positions. Polishing, polishing, polishing. Interesting keyhole style top loader bridge. So the strings don't go all the way through the body, they just sit under the top like it was an acoustic bridge. Needs a little bit of intonation work. This is very much like a Strat bridge, but they used hex-headed screws rather than Phillips heads. It takes a little bit longer to adjust because I don't happen to have a super long T-handled Allen wrench in this size. There's a bit of a dent in the back of the neck. It's actually pretty substantial. You can definitely feel it as you're sliding up and down. People ask about steaming out dents like this. Sometimes it's warranted. Sometimes I can look at this and realize it's not going to come back because the wood fibers, They're not just dented, they've been crushed and broken and split. We can try it, but I don't think it's going to do very much. I'll try and aid this by pre-wetting the area. This is all predicated on the idea that the moisture will swell the wood fibers and they'll have a certain memory and come back to the place where they were prior to being crushed. Like I say, this works fine for things like a soundboard, a softwood, that has been dented but not crushed. This maple might not do what we're hoping. The neck attachment system on the Kramer is a little less visually distracting. Got my soldering iron here, and a piece of dampened paper towel. And I'm just going to get the steam in. Now I've got to let that dry before I can apply some coats of, I think we'll use super glue. A light sanding to clean up the area and make sure that there'll be good bonding. This is so deep it will take multiple coats. Let's have a quick look here at this Harmony H77. I think it's late 60s. This is their take on a 335 style guitar. This one's in red burst, which is a desirable color. It's got 3 diamond gold foils, which themselves are quite desirable these days. Each of these has an on-off switch, so you get 6 different combinations. I'm in the middle of doing a refret. I'm going to change the tuners. And there's one other thing that we need to take care of. The shaft on the bridge volume pot has broken off, leaving a tiny, very sharp stump, which is not workable, and the knob has disappeared. Just buy a replacement? Good luck. I mean, you could if you want to spend $50 for a set of 2. Because these are pots with a mini shaft. It's not the standard diameter you'd find on a Gibson or Fender, so it's not like I can just take anything from the spare parts pile and pop it on there and make it work. I'm going to see if I can cast one from some resin using one of the other ones as a model, just to have something functional that will work with the modern mini pot I'm going to use for this. It won't be identical, but at least you'll be able to turn down the tone. Look how tiny the shafts are. It's very difficult to source a replacement for these. You can buy a whole harness from 60 years ago for used parts, but new stock, couldn't find one. This is a wild experiment, just a freebie, and I'm having some fun. I'm going to try and cast one of the existing knobs using this silicone gasket goo and epoxy, basically using up leftovers. Yes, I'm aware there are better casting mediums and resins, but I'm doing this with materials that are at hand, and I'm not charging him for it. Rowe Industries would very thoughtfully stamp the date of manufacture on the bottom of their de-armament pickups, and thus we learned that this guitar is actually from late 1963. I had a real dickens of a time trying to get this pot loose. Threads on the nut had been crushed into the shaft, and there wasn't enough height left to grip it, so they just spin together in concert. So I came to the conclusion that I'd have to drill it out. I started by making a landing place for the drill bit using a ball end mill in my Dremel. Then it was some careful drilling to get down past the crushed threads. Unfortunately, there's no way to access a single unit in this harness. The whole thing has to come out. Everything's got to be loosened off, so I'm tying thread around the pot shafts before pushing them inside. I managed to work the offending pot out of the body, along with its teammate. These pots are odd in their dimensions, and they are affixed to the base plate with little tabs, not in the same location you'd find on newer alpha pots, though. Boy, oh boy, has this ever been fun, working with this harness here. It's not like a Gibson ES style harness, which has its own kind of logic. It sort of snakes around in a circle. In this case, they've got these metal strips for each set of volume and tones for each pickup, which is kind of okay, but there was also so much extra wire kicking around inside the body there. They left the leads very long, and in fact one of the pickup leads was wrapped around encircling a post that's in the center here under the bridge. And the jack wire too is also very long and tends to get over into the area where you want to go. So I'd be pulling up on the small line which I had run to tie around each pot shaft. I'd get halfway and I'd see that this wire was stuck around the pot again. So yeah, this is like try number 5. I decided to get smart about things, take the whole harness out, shorten things where they needed to be shortened, and wrap them up with cable ties so it's a slightly neater package. But this has been one of the most annoying in a long time. Interesting that they have this kind of weird springy shielding stuff that goes around one wire and connects things together, which gives you a bit of a bounce, but you can't pull it very far because, of course, it's encircling the wires underneath. Yeah, okay, back at it.
And I go over there, and there was an older gentleman, Victor Reeves, from California Criminalistics Institute, who was basically recruiting for criminalistics, which I had never heard of. But he was saying, yeah.
It took some doing, but they eventually all got to their holes. Imagine my surprise when I pulled up the last pot, the one I'd replaced, only to find that the shaft was slightly too short to get the nut on. I don't know whether it had to do with the position or the way the pot was interacting with the plate. It might not have seated as perfectly as the old ones did. I checked in advance, and the threaded length was the same between the old and the new. Having spent hours at this point, I made the tough choice to drill deep enough to seat the nut. The recess gets covered by the diameter of the knob, and in the future it could be plugged if need be. It's time to unmold the replacement. Looks a bit like candy. The epoxy is much more amber in color than I imagined it would be. It kind of matches the paint job, though. The mold is also a bit distorted, but I managed to sand the top reasonably flat. Then I drilled an appropriately sized hole and heated the shaft of another pot to melt in the knurling. Put it together and it functions. Let's clean up the dings on the Kramer. I use a razor blade scraper, then sand and buff it out like I usually do with polishing compound. Of course you can still see it, but you can't feel it anymore. The bridge on the H-77 is not original. It would have been a typical wooden archtop bridge. This is off some other Japanese guitar, and it's had a few spacing configurations as you can see, but it works well. Considering this player likes higher than average action, it's not a bad choice because it's really stable. Thoughts? Does the inclusion of aluminum increase sustain? Maybe. I can't really tell. How would you know? You'd have to take these pickups out and mount them in something else. I will say of the two that we have here, the Kramer I find easier to play, but that probably has more to do with my own preferences. They're nicely made guitars. In some ways they remind me of playing one of the old Dan Armstrong Lucite models, the see-through ones. There's a kind of unyielding quality to these that some people might get along with. Let's plug them in.